Okay, today we have a guest, Wayne Benson. Wayne is a student, MFA candidate at Wilkes University. He's also working with Etruscan Press and with another press, Tupelo Press. But what we're going to talk to him about today is a new project that he started a few months ago, Basement Poetry Podcast. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Um, Wayne, tell us about the Basement Poetry Podcast.
Yeah, so the podcast, like you said, it started a couple of months ago. I think I started it in June. It was at about the height of COVID, and I was spending a lot of time in my basement, just, working on a bunch of different things. And there was a lot of free time at that time. And so I was thinking about just my relationship to poetry. And I was like, I want to start talking about poetry more. And so then I had a microphone and my laptop. And so a lot of people were doing podcasts at the time. And so I was just like, I'm going to start a podcast. It was a very random thought. And I was like, this is how I'm going to contribute to the poetry community. And so then I plugged in my microphone and I just got on and just started talking about it. I didn't do too much thinking about structure and stuff until after I started it. But then once I started getting feedback from people, I was like, this is something I can do for a while.
Cool. And so what was your initial podcast? What did you say? Hey, okay, what do I want to say about poetry here? I've got this platform.
Yeah.
What do I want to say?
Well, honestly, I felt like I had a unique relationship to poetry, having not been, because a lot of people, they'd be like, well, I've been reading since I was 5 and I've been always invested. And as a person who I feel like I got really invested later on in my life when poetry was finally given to me, I thought, well, how could I encourage people to get into poetry who may not have the intense reader background or are literary critics and different things like that? Like, how can I encourage everyone to find themselves in poetry? And so then I kind of use my own voice to kind of give that to people. And so the structure of it kind of just became a very casual and candid structure to talk about poetry. I would introduce the podcast, and then I would introduce the poet, introduce the poem, read the poem, and then give just my own kind of feedback based on what I saw immediately at that moment. So like sometimes I would wake up that morning, read a poem, and be like, oh, I'm going to read this poem on the podcast. And so it was a very candid feeling that I would get. And so that's what I was trying to give to my audience.
And what kind of feedback do you get from the podcast from your audience?
Honestly, it's very I'm like overwhelmed with gratitude the way people have been responding to it. At first I didn't think anyone would listen, but then people started to listen. And then they actually liked that I was giving the podcast in such a candid way, almost like a conversation. And people was like, I really enjoy that. And so that was really encouraging to me because that's exactly what I was trying to do. And then other people who are really invested in poetry were also listening, and they were saying how much they loved my interpretations of certain poems and different things like that. So then that was also encouraging me as a person in the literary arts that, my analysis is something that people want to hear. And so that's been really cool seeing the feedback continue to grow, because it starts out with like your family members listening.
Right, right.
And then next thing you know, you have people from all different places listening. It really grew out of nowhere.
And so what kind of things did you do, if anything, to drive traffic to the podcast? I mean, once it started to take off, how did you, get more people involved? Did you do any marketing or anything like that?
Well, I called it my little press run.
Okay.
Every time I would release an episode, I would do a little press run, and that would just be all my social media, so Facebook, Twitter is a big one. Even Snapchat, any social media you're on can help you gain traffic, because the people who may not, even if they don't care about what you're doing and they just care about you, they might share it, and so it kind of gets the ball rolling. So then you have random people you didn't even know cared about poetry or or what you're doing are like, hey, I love your podcast. I'm like, whoa, you actually were listening. Like, I haven't talked to you in 4 years. Like, how you're listening to my podcast?
That's
And
so
so
cool.
so I would do that. I'm a part of a community of poetry artists and different things in the Lehigh Valley. And so when we do our Zoom calls, they're like, hey, I saw you had a poetry podcast. So then I would, kind of tell them about it. And then so whatever groups I'm in, I also share the podcast with as well. And so that really drives traffic, because it starts to spread, and then they share, and then it spreads. And so
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that's so wonderful about this medium is that it's word of mouth, except
Hmm.
word of mouth that's electronic. People don't
Yeah,
actually have to be together in order to share this. And
exactly.
and and I think that's true in just about all publishing venues. Is how do people decide what to read or what to listen to? Well, their friends tell them.
Hmm.
People they know, recommend things, and
Yeah.
so if you can somehow get that ball rolling as you have, um, then you really, you followed, I think, the most productive marketing
Hmm.
method there is. Do you have any way of keeping track of who's listening?
So I started the podcast through a software or a platform called Anchor. And Anchor is, I think Spotify owns it, but Anchor is a free platform that you can basically record your podcast and then upload it. And Anchor will actually distribute it to the different podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all the different platforms. And so whenever I release an episode, I'll go to Anchor to see, how many plays it got that day. It tells you, from which area of the world people are listening.
Wow.
It tells you the demographics age wise. So like I can tell like which age demographic listens to my podcast the most, and even male versus female or something like that. Like they tell you all these different stats that go into just one episode, and then it continues to grow. And
That's amazing. What is your demographic?
so my demographic is definitely my age. So like between 20 and 27
Yeah.
is the highest age group, and surprisingly, the second highest age group is like 60 and up. And
That's because we have nothing else to do, Wayne. We're just hanging out.
I know, and I'm just like, wow. So it's crazy. I'm just like, I'm glad that people that aren't just my age group are actually
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
listening as well.
Yeah, no,
And so
I'm laughing about that. I shouldn't laugh because actually that is really indicative of the breadth of uh, your interpretation. I mean, the fact that it appeals
mm,
to such a broad group of people, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
yeah,
I mean, because obviously people in their 60s are coming from a different poetic tradition and expectations than people in their 20s. So if you're appealing to both,
yeah,
and I suppose to all the people in between, that speaks to some real uh,
yeah,
some real breadth of coverage, which is great.
yeah.
Um,
I try to oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead. I was just gonna just go ahead.
Oh yeah, no. So like in trying to make it a place where like all age groups can come, I try to read poetry from a bunch of different time periods.
Okay,
So I'll read contemporary poetry, I'll read modern poetry, romantic poetry. I'll go between the different time periods, and recently actually I've started to read poetry from literary magazines that I
interesting,
find, and so that's
interesting.
been also an interesting and very encouraging place to find poetry.
When you feature contemporary poets, have you had any feedback from those poets? Have you?
Actually, I actually have one example I have is so there was this review called Chestnut Review, and they were I found them on Twitter, one day. And so I go on their website, I look at their most recent issue, and I find a poem, and I'm just like, man, I really love this poem. And so then my first instinct was, well, let me reach out to the press, or let me reach out to the review to ask them if I can read the poem on my podcast. So then they were like, well, we can get you in touch with the author and they can give you permission. And so then they got me in touch with the author of the poem. And so I asked him like, hey, can I read your poem on my podcast? And he was like, I would love to hear you read it and this and that. And so then this past week, I read the poem on the podcast and made sure that he knew, gave him credit, gave the review their credit. And then he emails me again after he listens to the podcast, and he's just like, oh, I loved your interpretation of the poem. And so my mind blown at this point. It's like, wow, he actually liked how like my reading of the poem. And he's like, so those kind of things make me feel like I'm actually being a good literary citizen in a way. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right.
And
No,
so
and
that's really encouraging.
making connections out there and
Yeah.
doing it in this real immediate way. So, what's next, Wayne? Where do you see this going?
I mean, I see it as of right now, like continuing where it's at. So like I've been connecting with different podcasters and different poets, but then I also want to eventually, do something where there's more interviews involved, maybe with different poets, not just having my opinion on a poem, but maybe getting another poet to join the podcast and we discuss a poem together. Because as of right now, it's really just my opinion.
Yeah.
And as much as I love my own opinion, I would love to, really engage in a discussion between different people, maybe people who don't read poetry, and then also people who do read poetry, to get different perspectives on the podcast.
Cool. Cool. And as you say, you've talked to other podcasters. What podcasts do you recommend for us besides your own?
Yeah, so one that I definitely recommend is called The Poet Heroic.
Oh,
And it's funny because so his name is Timothy O'Brien, I think. Yeah. And he reached out to me from listening to my podcast. And he actually just read one of my poems on his podcast
all right.
this past week, which was super interesting. But yeah, his poem just so like whereas my podcast is more you have the reading and the interpretation, his is strictly just reading.
Okay.
And so it's a really cool podcast if you just want to go and listen to like 4 or 5 poems just read, and his voice is really, really amazing as far as the reading goes. And so I would definitely recommend that podcast for sure. The Daily Podcast is another one. I think that's run by NPR though. But the Daily Podcast is a podcast which I listened to before I ever started the Daily Poem, sorry. Is a podcast I listened to before I ever started my podcast. And they kind of do a similar structure where they introduce a poem, they read the poem and then give a little bit of interpretation. But they've been running a lot longer than me.
Right, right, right. Well, the big daddy, and I wouldn't even know if this would be called a podcast as much as a radio show.
Mm,
Uh, I'm trying. What is it? The fellow who does the Prairie Home Companion. Oh, I'm having a senior moment. Everybody remembers, and he would do a poem every morning on his radio show on the Prairie Home
really?
Companion, and just read the poem. It's very famous,
Okay.
uh, radio personality. Oh, everyone in the world knows him, and they're all yelling at the screen right now. You know. Um, but anyway, but that I think that was in the days before podcasts. So
Mm,
in your case, it's streaming, right? So
yeah.
people can listen to it live,
Hmm.
or they can.
Actually, it's not live yet.
Oh, all right. So
Yeah,
everybody's
yeah.
listening to
I
it
do
recorded.
yeah, it's recorded and then
Okay,
uploaded every week. Yeah.
got it, got it.
So, but I would like to get to a place where it's a live recording.
Okay. When
Definitely, that would be
you
awesome.
when you record it, do you edit?
I edit a little bit. It's very minimal because I I find that especially when you're beginning something like this, the editing can really take your love away from it
Hmm.
very quickly because loving the art and then loving to edit is a different thing.
Right.
And when I first started, I wanted it to sound like every other podcast. I needed it to be perfect in my head. And I could already see myself like stepping back. So then I told myself, don't worry about editing so much. Just do what you came to do, and that's read the poem and give your feedback. And so because of that, I do very minimal editing. The editing I do is just like if there's a bunch of excess ums maybe, or
Right.
like too much, I breathe too hard into the microphone or something, then I might edit those out. But as far as anything else, it's just to get the levels of the noise correctly maybe, but I don't do a whole lot of editing. My editing might take 30 minutes, if that. And so,
Did you make a conscious decision to say to monitor the length of your podcast, or is that a formula that podcasts always follow?
um, I did make the conscious decision to make, so I try to go for anywhere between 9 to 12 minutes
I see.
in that area. I do know a lot of podcasts um, can do longer podcasts, but I think for the way mine is structured, that 9 to 12 minute mark is really good because it's just me at this moment. And so, trying to keep the audience engaged for a longer duration with just one voice is kind of difficult. And I know that from listening to podcasts. Um, but I think later on, when I get other people involved, it could end up being longer because then there's a lot more to talk about.
Right. Right. And how often do you publish?
Right now, it's about once or twice a week. It's still very candid. Like some days, like some weeks, I might post like 3 podcasts, and then other weeks I might post 1 or 2. It really just depends. But I actually saw a spike, which I thought this was weird because a lot of people will tell you in the beginning to just push out as much content as you can to get your viewers up. But I saw a spike in viewers when I dropped down to 1 podcast a week.
Oh,
So I
interesting.
thought I thought that was interesting for me.
Now, excuse my ignorance, but when you say viewers, is this a visual and audio, or just audio? Because I thought podcasts
Oh,
were just audio.
oh yeah, just audio. I'm sorry. I meant listeners, but I
Okay.
kind of treat them similar in my head.
Okay, that's
So
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I have listened to podcasts, and I always thought I didn't know that there was also a potential video aspect. I guess there isn't. I guess that it's
yeah.
usually audio, isn't it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of video
Are there?
podcasts
Oh yeah.
now. Yeah, a lot because YouTube has gotten so big and people can really make a living off of YouTube. I feel like a lot of people have been moving their podcasts from just audio to visual
Got it.
aspect. But and I thought about that a lot too, whether I wanted to have a video aspect of it too. And I think um, that's something to think about for later. But right now, I think with just the way my platform is set up, it's better as an audio experience.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I can see that because I know that when I've listened to podcasts, it's always been, on my phone and
Hmm.
through an ear. It's not like I'm sitting down to do this.
Exactly.
I'm going
Yep.
and doing somewhere else. So, do on your platform, do listeners do they actually have the opportunity to give feedback there and say, "Hey, I listened," and is there like a web page?
Oh, well, okay. Yes, there is a web page, but I also give an email in my during the episode. I always provide an email that they can send me inquiries to where like
Okay,
so like if they have a poem they like, say, hey, send me that poem. I'll read it and give my own interpretation of that poem.
great,
So
great. So
yeah,
you have kind of a mailing list.
exactly. Somewhere it's a way that I can stay in contact with those people who listen
Got it.
and stuff like that.
Got it.
And that's an aspect I definitely want to grow more.
So, and what is the URL
The URL. Oh
for
God.
your web?
Yeah, well, dang, how would I do that? How would I say the URL? I don't
You
know,
know, the
but
name of the website how would I
oh,
access it? How would I get to your podcast?
okay. Well, if you go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or Anchor, which is ACHOR, and yeah, Anchor.fm, you can just type in Basement Poetry Podcast, and it'll be the only one that shows up. I promise, because I've searched it. I've searched it, which is
Okay,
funny because it was a great name to put because it just pops up right up to the top. And the only
oh,
reason I named it that was because I've sit in this basement
right.
and I and I read poetry.
Right, but it sounds cool, and it also brings
Yeah,
up an idea of kind of underground and
exactly.
fresh. You know, I mean, it has
Yep.
it and candid, or I mean, all those things.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yep.
come to mind when you say that.
Yeah, that's
So
why I think the name stuck.
yeah, it sounds like it has. It sounds like this is going to be around for a long time, and it's going to grow. So thank you so much, Wayne. Wayne Benson. He's a
Thanks for
poet,
having me.
podcaster, um, editor at Etruscan and Tupelo Press, and a candidate for an MFA at Wilkes University. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you for having me.